What's really interesting in the high political story here is that the fact that the United States was also concerned about maintaining goodwill made basing a really powerful and lucrative bargaining chip for Latin American leaders. So when the U.S., approached them for this particular form of cooperation that they knew would be really contentious and really unpopular, that put leaders in Latin America in a position of saying, okay, if you want bases, you're going to have to provide us with some kind of a quid pro quo. Some leaders were super successful in doing that. Getulio Vargas in Brazil was able to get the United States to really finance a lot of his agenda for Brazilian development because the U.S. was so desperate to obtain airfields in Brazil, and Brazil was in a strong bargaining position.
I'm Tyler McBrien, managing editor of Lawfare, and this is the Lawfare podcast, November 18th, 2022. Today, the U.S. military maintains around 800 bases and installations around the world, with around 75 of those in Latin America, including perhaps its most notorious in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. But it wasn't always this way. To learn more about this fraught and understudied history, I sat down with Dr. Rebecca Herman, assistant professor of history at UC Berkeley, to discuss her new book, Cooperating with the Colossus, A Social and Political History of U.S. Military Bases in World War II Latin America. We discuss how the U.S. went from its good neighbor policy of the 1930s to nearly 200 military bases on sovereign Latin American soil by the end of the war, and the thorny questions of legal jurisdiction, labor rights, and gender relations that arose from those new sites. We also got into how, in Professor Herman's words, although national sovereignty and international cooperation are compatible concepts in principle, they're difficult to reconcile in practice. It's the Lawfare podcast, November 18th. Rebecca Herman on Cooperating with the Colossus. Now, your book takes place largely during the period of World War II, which is seen by many, I would say, as a high watermark for U.S. and Latin American relations, and then also as one that's fairly perhaps understudied or underappreciated, especially in 20th century U.S. Latin American relations. So I'm curious, just to start out from a high level, what story your book tells, and how does it sort of add to or refine or even challenge that traditional narrative of World War II U.S. Latin American cooperation or relations?
Yeah, so as you said, World War II is often thought of as this sort of atypical moment in the history of 20th century U.S. Latin American relations because it was this moment of intense Pan-American camaraderie. It was seen as this kind of high in the history of U.S. Latin American relations, the closest that Pan-Americanism ever came to really realizing the potential that many people had believed Pan-Americanism could hold for a long time. There was a lot of good reason for that. The nations of the Americas did ultimately come together and break ties with the Axis powers. Many Latin American republics declared war. Brazil and Mexico both sent men to fight. And so a lot of this narrative is based on this sort of high political diplomatic story about unity with the Allied cause during World War II. And that stands in contrast to the broader history of U.S. Latin American relations, which is more often organized around the history of interventionism, of U.S. incursions in Latin America, of U.S. sort of bullish behavior in the region that stoked a lot of anti-U.S. nationalism. So what my book does is it takes the history of basing specifically, which was the most contentious form of wartime cooperation. So it was an aspect of the wartime alliance that doesn't get a ton of attention, but stands out because it really tested that Pan-American rhetoric. And it kind of revealed some of the real tensions that existed between two ideals that the nations of the Americas held up as essential to inter-American relations during this period, which were inter-American cooperation on the one hand and national sovereignty on the other. So a real cornerstone of the positive aspect of U.S. Latin American relations during this period was the United States' professed respect for the territorial sovereignty of the Latin American republics, which the U.S. had not particularly respected in the past. And so because basing brought up all of these really complicated tensions between sovereignty and cooperation, you see some of the fissures in that wartime alliance through basing. Basing gives us an opportunity to think about cooperation as a contentious feature of U.S. Latin American relations that goes far beyond the war period specifically. So one of the things that I want my book to contribute to the conversation is that cooperation, we don't often think of cooperation when we think of US Latin American relations because it has a rosy connotation. I have two young kids at home. When we think about cooperation, we think of it as an inherently good thing. What my book wants to do is to view cooperation critically as a space where power is negotiated, and to take cooperation between the US and Latin American republics seriously as something that Latin Americans have been eager to do for a long time, despite all of the inherent risks and often the negative consequences. And so by looking at this contentious component of cooperation during this kind of high moment, I'm trying to open a conversation about cooperation in the history of the Americas long term.
Yeah, and I like what you were saying about taking cooperation seriously. I think one thing that really comes out in your book is, I think if the traditional view of cooperation is, depending on if you view U.S. hegemony in the 20th century in Latin America favorably or not. So if you don't, then U.S. cooperation only, as you said, thwarts democracy or social justice, and if you don't, it's it was beneficial with economic development and investment. But your book, I think, complicates that dichotomy really well.
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad that's the way you saw it. I mean, my concern throughout was that I felt like I constantly had to put cooperation between scare quotes when I was using it, because I wanted to make sure that the reader understood that I was not trying to make a value judgment about the history of U.S. Latin American relations. And, as a Latin Americanist, I'm extremely critical of U.S. foreign policy in the region. But what I think our desire to critique U.S. foreign policy in Latin America has led to is insufficient engagement with the efforts of Latin Americans to try to steer the course of cooperation with the United States in a way that would be beneficial for them. And when we do pay attention to that, we're looking at Augusto Pinochet, we're looking at figures who have been, right-wing anti-communists, people who engaged the U.S. in these these projects that had really negative impacts, obviously, on civil society in Latin America. But there are a whole host of people in Latin America who tried to engage U.S. power and U.S. resources in other ways. They often failed, or they often brought about consequences that weren't of the nature that they wanted. But I think once we start to look at cooperation beyond those spaces where we most often look, we begin to see a more interesting story about the nature of inter-American politics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to get into that middle point between, I think I'm guilty of this. I think before reading your book, I viewed U.S. relations with Latin America either as intervention in the form of, a coup of a democratically elected leader, or complete non-intervention of the good neighbor policy. But I think a lot of the stories that you tell exist in this space between. So to get back to an earlier question, what was the process through which the U.S. and the U.S. and Latin America went from the good neighbor policy of the pre-war years to then 200 defense installations on sovereign soil in Latin America by the end of the war?
Yeah, that is the question that I was eager to figure out when I started down this path. I had seen mention of these bases in passing here and there, but I hadn't seen any more detailed histories about them and what that entailed, and how Latin American leaders, particularly places where nationalists were in power, were in a position to accept U.S. bases, given the sort of political baggage that a U.S. military presence carried at this point in time. So for the first several decades of the 20th century, the U.S. repeatedly intervened militarily in Latin American affairs, particularly in the Latin American republics in the Circum-Caribbean region. So not so much in South America, but more in the Caribbean and Central America and Mexico. And part of this was stemming from a pretty condescending posture of superiority when it came to democratic governance, and a sense that the United States' role in the region was to provide tutelage to the people of the Americas who were perhaps not yet fit for self-government. And so there were a number of occupations and other sorts of military interventions that ended up stoking a lot of anti-U.S. sentiment. And by the late 20s, Washington had begun to move away from this. There was a sense that these kinds of interventions only created more instability. They created more trouble than they solved. Of course, with the Great Depression, U.S. priorities changed significantly. There was growing popular opposition within the United States to the idea that we would be spending resources on these sorts of things when there were more pressing issues at home. And you also see the rise of mass politics in Latin America during this period. So there's revolutionary nationalism spreading across the region, manifesting in different countries in different ways. But a lot of times, part of that new revolutionary nationalism has anti-US sentiment baked into it. And so that becomes part of the consequence of US interventionism. And there had long been a campaign among jurists and diplomats in Latin America who were trying to use multilateralism and international law and international norms to basically convince the United States to place limits on itself. At meetings of the Pan American Union over the years, countries would set forth resolutions where all American republics agree, not to intervene in the domestic affairs of any other state. And repeatedly, the US government would refuse to sign on to those kinds of principles until 1933. So in 1933, which is often identified as a really important moment in the articulation of the good neighbor policy, the American republics met in Montevideo, and the US delegation agreed to this principle of non-intervention in the Americas. So even though Washington had been kind of moving in this direction, 1933 is sort of seen as this really important moment in the advent of what is called the good neighbor policy, which was a policy of non-intervention in the domestic affairs of the other American republics, and in some ways was seen as a pretty dramatic sea change in US foreign policy in the region. So, there's been a lot of attention to the ways that over the course of the 1930s, the US simply expanded its toolkit for influencing the domestic affairs of other American republics. So using non-intervention as a way to sort of improve the United States' reputation in the region by being a better neighbor, while also pursuing maybe economic and cultural forms of influence. And when hostilities mounted in Europe, when a new world war appeared to be on the horizon, the goodwill that the good neighbor policy generated towards the United States and Latin America became really important from a strategic perspective. Strategists were concerned about the extent to which anti-US sentiment in Latin America could create opportunities for enemy inroads in the region. There were already concerns about fascist parties in Latin America that stoked all kinds of paranoia among US strategists. And so this idea that the good neighbor policy had gone a long way in improving the United States' reputation and fostering goodwill towards the US and Latin America became really important. And at the same time, from a more sort of concrete tactical perspective, advances in aviation had made defense strategists really concerned about US vulnerability to aerial attack. And so at the same time that on the one hand, you have folks saying, okay, it's a strategic imperative that we maintain goodwill towards the United States and Latin America, you had other folks saying, we need defense installations, we need military bases, we just need a bigger aviation infrastructure so that we could unilaterally defend the Americas from Axis aggression, because we're much more vulnerable now than we were in the naval age, right? We're now in a position where the distance between places has shrunk considerably, and we need more infrastructure, not less. The problem was these two security imperatives, goodwill and basing, seemed quite clearly like they were going to run at cross purposes, because the legacy of US intervention and US occupation in Latin America was very closely identified with the US military presence. So part of the challenge that the United States faced was how to advance this basing agenda without sullying the project of Pan-American solidarity.
So I think we've established pretty well, why, or rather, you have established well why the United States, pursued the project of basing in Latin America. I want to shift focus to the conundrum then faced by Latin American leaders and diplomats. And I will say one thing I loved about your book is that it's both a social and political history. And so, as you said, you cover the high politics and then also what was happening on the ground. But first, I want to focus in on the former. What was the conundrum or the crisis that Latin American leaders faced in these negotiations with the basing? And feel free to draw on, I know you focused specifically on three countries in the book, so feel free to draw on those. But I guess, this is a question spanning the region.
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, the conundrum that Latin American leaders faced was, this was a period, as I mentioned previously, where you saw a rise in mass politics in the region. There was a sort of strong wave of revolutionary nationalism. At the same time, there would grow to be support for the war effort, but the nature of Pan-American solidarity or Pan-American cooperation in the war effort really mattered in terms of popular perception. So there was a clear sense that while people were perhaps on board with closer economic collaboration or, celebrating, the myth of the New World as a rationale for Pan-American unity and preventing the war from coming to the Americas, there was a lot less appetite for a U.S. military presence. And so the position that Latin American leaders were in was that they had to make sure that their cooperation did not just consist of becoming a staging grounds for the U.S. military. What's really interesting in the high political story here is that the fact that the United States was also concerned about maintaining goodwill made basing a really powerful and lucrative bargaining chip for Latin American leaders. So when the U.S., approached them for this particular form of cooperation that they knew would be really contentious and really unpopular, that put leaders in Latin America in a position of saying, okay, if you want bases, you're going to have to provide us with some kind of a quid pro quo. Some leaders were super successful in doing that. Getulio Vargas in Brazil was able to get the United States to really finance a lot of his agenda for Brazilian development because the US was so desperate to obtain airfields in Brazil, and Brazil was in a strong bargaining position. So they could do this in a number of ways. There were ways that certain development goals really dovetailed nicely with U.S. security objectives. So, for instance, we talked about this is a moment where you're seeing advances in aviation. Latin American republics were interested in expanding their civil aviation infrastructure, right? Modernizing airfields, expanding the infrastructure that they had. And so that was a place where U.S. and Latin American desires aligned, albeit for different reasons. Transportation infrastructure of other kinds, road building, public health infrastructure. The U.S. was really concerned with extracting raw materials in Latin America that would be vital to the war effort. So all of these were places where you could see why Latin American leaders, who are perhaps less concerned with what's going on in Europe, but more concerned with national development, would see an opportunity here.
One thing I think that your book demonstrated really well was that there was an ideological hurdle as well. And one thing that struck me was a really interesting sort of framing solution that both the U.S. and Latin American leaders had in terms of overcoming this sovereignty cooperation tension. So I wonder if you could speak to that framing solution as well, not just the material exchange, but also this sort of ideological compromise.
So let me say, while the U.S. is negotiating bilaterally with each American republic individually on the basis of what the U.S. imagines that particular republic has to offer in terms of natural resources or desired airfields, at the multilateral level, the foreign ministers of the Americas were convening periodically to declare their solidarity. And at one point, there's this sort of agreement that in the Americas, an attack on any one republic will be perceived as an attack on all republics. So a lot of the terms of cooperation that they develop are contingent upon this idea that if there's an attack on the Americas, on any one part of the Americas, then we're all in this together. So they're operating in these two different fields. So the attack on Pearl Harbor ends up making much more cooperation much more palatable to the people of the Americas. That rationale for everybody banding together is now real. Before that, it's much trickier because there are a lot of people in the Americas who feel like, this isn't really our fight. This might just be an opportunity for the United States to expand further into the region. This is just a sort of an opportunistic imperialist move. And so in that period before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the leaders of the Americas are much more cautious in what they concede. Meanwhile, in Washington, particularly in the State Department, there's a sense that military basing is just going to be too unpopular for any Latin American leader to successfully permit. And so the proposal that ends up winning the day is the War Department should find a private company that can advance airfield construction under the guise of commercial expansion. And that way, the U.S. government doesn't look like it's, reverting to the pre-good neighbor days, and Latin American leaders don't look like they're guilty of, selling out the nation. And so the plan that's ultimately pursued is the War Department contracts the airline, Pan American Airways, to undertake this construction. The designs are provided by the War Department. The money is provided by Roosevelt's War Emergency Fund. But it's Pan Am that goes to the government in each country where construction is sought figures out what permits are required, presents the plans, and all of this is done under the guise of commercial expansion. Now, what the archives show is that most often the heads of state in each of these places in Latin America knew who the sponsor of the program actually was. I mean, at the same time that they're having staff conversations with Latin America, with the U.S. security forces about the kinds of aerial infrastructure they want, Pan Am shows up proposing to build that very infrastructure. So it was sort of an open secret in the diplomatic sphere. But what it allowed both the US and Latin American allies to do was to sort of shield themselves from popular perception or popular rejection of US basing in the region. So most of the bases that were built, all of the bases that were built before Pearl Harbor began to go up as Pan Am construction projects.
Yeah, it's so interesting, that sort of guise. And, I think so far we've spoken about how national sovereignty and international cooperation are compatible and can be reconciled, I think, in high politics. But I think a lot of the meat of your book goes into how in practice it's not so easy, to understate it. So before we go into some of these governance issues that communities around bases faced, I'm curious just to give the listeners a better visual of what we're talking about when we say installations or bases or airfields. What do these look like? How big were they? Who were staffing them? The listeners obviously can't see this, but there's an excellent map at the beginning of the book. So, and if you could give a bit about the distribution of them throughout the region.
Oh, yeah, that's a great idea. So when I say defense installation, part of the challenge in this book was figuring out the proper vocabulary, because at this point in time, now estimates of the U.S. global basing footprint is anywhere from, 700 to 850, depending on where you look at the numbers. That is not the case prior to World War II. World War II is really when the U.S. global military footprint explodes. And so now we have this really elaborate vocabulary for what you call different kinds of military installations abroad. And that elaborate vocabulary did not exist back then. Airfields, air bases, airports were often used interchangeably. And so it was a challenge as I was writing to figure out what are the words I should use to make sure that I'm conveying what I mean to convey. So the 200 defense installations really covers a really dramatically diverse set of facilities. You had everything from, radio installations in the forest in the Isthmus of Panama to the largest U.S. air base outside of U.S. continental borders in the Brazilian Northeast. So this is a really broad, inclusive category. Once you drill down into the larger bases, that number shrinks considerably. But it was particularly important to me to include the more inclusive number because Panama is one of the three countries that I look at most closely. And Panama permitted the U.S. to use 134 defense sites outside of the canal zone, which is just such a huge number for such a small country and was really significant in the course of Panamanian history. In terms of how these facilities are distributed, the idea initially, particularly with that Pan Am project that I described, was to create two chains of airfields that would encircle the Americas, and in particular would allow the U.S. Armed Forces to defend the Panama Canal and prevent an assault on the United States from South America. There was this fear of a transatlantic attack across the South Atlantic from West Africa to the northeast of Brazil. And then the thinking was, the Brazilian Northeast is largely indefensible. If German forces, for example, were able to get a foothold in the Brazilian Northeast, they'd been in a really good position to either attack the Panama Canal or the United States. So when you look at the map, you can kind of see how there are these two chains of facilities that run through the Caribbean and along the northern coast of South America and around what they call the Brazilian Bulge, the northeastern part of the Brazilian coastline. And then the other runs through Mexico, Central America, and along kind of meets that first chain along the northern coast of South America. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. got set about building more facilities on the Pacific coast of South America. But the initial focus had really been around the canal and the Brazilian Northeast.
Now that we have a better picture of these sites and where they are, I would love to dig into some of these issues that you raised through quite deep archival research into the governance issues around the base. So, in terms of labor rights, discrimination, gender relations, I want to get to those, but first I wanted to talk a bit about some of these jurisdictional issues that came up. I think some of these sort of legal paradoxes would be pretty interesting to listeners. I think I want to start with, I guess, where you start. So the first chapter, which you call the specter of Guantanamo, one really interesting aspect to me was actually the 1903 lease, in which Cuba retained, quote, ultimate sovereignty over the leased lands and waters of Guantanamo, but that the U.S. retained, quote, complete jurisdiction and control therein. So I think that, this kind of really stuck out to me as a good encapsulation of these jurisdictional issues. Could you speak to a bit of some of these stories, in terms of U.S. service members, committing acts of violence or crime or arson, and then the conflicts that arose afterwards?
Yeah. So the reason that first chapter is called The Specter of Guantanamo, as you will imagine, is that Guantanamo, which the US acquired in 1903, seemed to represent everything that was wrong with the old way of doing things in the Americas. So it was a symbol of US imperialism and bullishness in the region. And this idea that Cuba was sovereign over the territory that Guantanamo occupies, but that the US would exercise complete jurisdiction therein, just encapsulated the aspects of US policy in Latin America that Latin Americans found so objectionable, and the aspects of US policy that good neighbor Washington was meant to distance itself from. So if the new rhetoric of the day is, we respect all of the American republics as our sovereign equal peers, we respect the territorial integrity of the other American republics, and we no longer are going to assume this posture of superiority that, our fellow American republics need us to teach them how to govern themselves, then jurisdictional questions really kind of dredged all of that old history back up. Because from the beginning, US military leadership was very clear. It is imperative that we maintain jurisdiction over our men while they're overseas. So that, from their perspective, was a non-negotiable, and they believed that that was a right that they were entitled to on the basis of international law. Latin American leaders were absolutely unwilling, for the most part, to concede that the US would have jurisdiction over their men while in Latin America, because that seemed like a form of extraterritoriality that was reminiscent of the pre-Good Neighbor era days, and that would be a backsliding. Again, nationalists in power did not feel that they could put that on paper and without great political costs. And it also went against what they believed in. And so the question of jurisdiction was such a contentious one from the beginning. I also, circling back to the idea that this is the moment in which the US military footprint really goes global in a way that it will maintain to the present. There was no tradition of status of forces agreements at this point in time. That's a status of forces agreements, which dictate the terms of governance over US military bases overseas, are a feature of post-war basing. So there wasn't really a lot of precedent to draw on at this point. The precedent that did exist consisted of US bases in places that the US had not professed to view as sovereign equals. So there's this real concern in Latin America with making sure that there wasn't just a huge proliferation of Guantanamos across the region. And one of the kind of markers of whether this was any different than Guantanamo was around who was in charge, right? So in most cases in the high political realm, the agreement was to just leave the issue of jurisdiction out of written agreements entirely, which meant that at the end of the day, they sorted this stuff out on the ground. The US did, more often than not, maintain jurisdiction over US troops in Latin America throughout the course of the war. In each place, a little bit of a different system developed. These were sort of improvised on the ground, but for the most part, in most places, the tradition would be, if US military police arrested, for example, a Brazilian national, they would turn that person over to Brazilian police. And if Brazilian police arrested a US soldier, they would turn that man over to the US military police. So that informal arrangement was exercised in practice. This was true in Brazil, this was true in Cuba. But when occasionally someone from the State Department might say to the US ambassador in Havana, hey, I understand that in practice we exercise jurisdiction here. Can we formalize that? Can we get this in writing? the answer was always no. We are getting what we want in practice. Let's not rock the boat. This is a political hot potato. But that did create a setting in which any incident between U.S. servicemen and the local community could become this issue of international relations and could have kind of bigger reverberations. A complicating factor was that a lot of times, the U.S. military presence really upset existing social practices. And so, for example, in a conservative town in northern Brazil, where I did a lot of research, there was an instance where 2 U.S. servicemen and 2 Brazilian women were arrested coming out of a movie theater. And the crime was moral offense. And there's all this paperwork going back and forth between the US and Brazilian governments because the folks in the US are trying to figure out what that means. And from what they can gather from their perspective, whatever was actually going on didn't seem all that immoral. But so this, begs the question, well, immoral according to whom? Law is not just about, technical legal authority, but also about establishing social norms and policing social norms. And so in instances where the loss of that authority to police the behavior of US servicemen felt like the loss of the authority to maintain certain social customs or to preserve certain, gender relations, then those issues became all the more explosive. That theater incident created a lot more paperwork than, for example, vehicular manslaughter, which both parties could agree was a bad thing.
I want to stay on the ground, so to speak, to highlight another intervention that I think your book makes in that, communities around the bases, weren't only having to react to issues that arose, but actually also many people would proactively use the circumstances to advance their own means, and sometimes often quite creatively. So could you speak to some of those stories about how people, faced with this new base in their community, were able to maybe redirect or funnel some of those resources for their own lives?
Yeah, so this is one of the parallels that I saw as I was looking at, okay, what's going on the ground and what's going on in the high political realm. US basing ends up colliding with local social and political conflicts in a number of unexpected ways. And so people who have a different position within that conflict trying to find ways to advance their interests in the face of the US presence. So one example is this question of labor rights. In Brazil and Cuba, over the course of the 1930s, you saw the rise of really progressive labor legislation that kind of aligned with this broader rise of mass politics in the region. And US defense contractors from very early on were not interested in observing many of the newly won labor rights, particularly those that would make base construction more expensive or might slow it down. So the fact that these bases began to be built at this particular moment in the labor histories of each of these countries is really interesting, because in both cases, there were newly won labor rights on paper, but whether those rights were going to be upheld in practice or enforced in practice really remained to be seen. And so people advocating for labor rights could take the United States violation of their rights as an opportunity to frame the enforcement of labor rights as a nationalist and proper response to the situation. If the Brazilian labor courts did not uphold Brazilian labor rights, then that could be seen as sort of a betrayal of the Brazilian people because this is a foreign power an agent of a foreign power that is violating those rights. Similarly, in, ongoing changes around the nature of gender relations, for example, in conservative Catholic parts of Brazil, where I did some of my research, you had conservative Catholics who were very concerned with the perception that Brazilian women, so this is the moment where you see the rise of the modern woman, the idea that Brazilian women were losing their way, right? Because they're going out into the workforce, they're socializing in public, they're changing some of the social norms that had, determined the nature of women's behavior in society. Previously, the defenders of the old patriarchal, male honor could point to the United States as the perverting factor, the US military presence as the perverting factor, and sort of ascribe an external source to explain women's behavior and paint their own positions as nationalist and proper. So it just kind of injected all of these local conflicts with a new set of factors that hadn't been there necessarily before the bases started to go up. Certainly, these debates would continue after the bases went away, but it did complicate those local conflicts in ways that I found really fascinating.
I think that answer illustrates how this, your book is a very dynamic history, and that it shows that cooperating with the Colossus, often people were able to do it or try to do it on their own terms, I think, as you've written, and to, make the most out of this engagement while still keeping their interests centered, which was an interesting intervention for me, as I said. I think, one thing you said earlier about the figure of, the footprint of today's U.S. military bases, I think the figure is something, upwards of 700, 800 installations around the world, really shows that this is not an isolated history. So I'm curious to what happened, at war's end. What were the fate of some of these bases? Were they maintained or did they fold?
Yeah, so at the end of the war, a lot of the bases the US government was happy to abandon. They were no longer needed. But there was a core network that US officials really wanted to maintain. And in some places, like Brazil and Panama, the leaders of those countries saw the desire for extended basing rights as a new opportunity for fresh bargaining, right? Like this could be the source of a continued quid pro quo that would be beneficial in advancing the kinds of nation building objectives that those leaders had had since the beginning of the war. But a couple things had changed that were really significant in preventing the United States from ultimately extending those basing rights. One big one was, of course, the war had provided the justification for tolerating a US military presence on sovereign soil in Latin America. And when the war ends, that rationale goes away. So you have a lot of people who are saying, okay, if you want to prove that the good neighbor policy still exists, the only way to do that is to pack up and leave and prove that this wasn't just a ploy to, extend the United States reach into Latin America for good. You also had, with the end of war, a real boost in Communist Party membership in Latin America. The sort of Soviet contributions to the success of the war effort were a boon to the left in Latin America. And you had a strong push for democracy in Latin America. This is a period historians talk about as a democratic spring in Latin American history. And so you had this really, ideologically diverse and vibrant left that became very vocal in opposition to the bases. So Latin American communists had largely kept their mouth shut about US basing during the war because they were, devoted to the war effort. And when the war is over, that devotion goes away and they can kind of resume their natural state of anti-US campaigning. And so in both Brazil and in Panama, popular protests really make the continued US presence impossible. And in Panama, especially, there's a mass mobilization, a mass outpouring against a treaty that the US and Panamanian governments concluded that would have extended the United States rights at a certain selection of the bases that were created during the war. And the Panamanian National Assembly ultimately is forced to refuse to ratify the agreement. And a lot of Panamanians and historians of Panama view that as a particularly important turning point in the nation's struggle against the US occupation of the Panama Canal Zone, because that was sort of the beginning of a popular mobilization against the US presence that, at that point didn't dare contemplate the end of US ownership over the Canal Zone, but later would. And so the subsequent struggles for the end of US ownership of the canal grew from that moment in the eyes of many.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I think you described well what happened after the war in Latin America, a sort of return to an anti-US interventionist status quo, which makes sense. I don't think people's memories were so short as to forget everything that happened before the war. But turning to the legacy in the US, what lessons do you think US policymakers took away from this new what you call the political economy of security cooperation, especially as the Cold War began, either during World War II or immediately after, depending on how you look at it?
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the obvious takeaways was that basing, because it's territorial and because it so blatantly exposed the challenges of reconciling sovereignty and cooperation, was particularly unwelcome and problematic while other forms of cooperation that the US and Latin American partners had engaged in during the war were not. They did not provoke the same kind of popular backlash. One of those forms of cooperation that really originated during the war that would become especially important to the course of US Latin American relations during the Cold War was military cooperation. It was during World War II that the US became a particularly present partner for the security forces of the Americas, particularly in the places that the US hadn't occupied. Prior to that, in South America, the armed forces of South American nations were much more likely to have military advisors from Germany or France than they were the United States. All of that changes by the end of the war. What began as sort of a diplomatic initiative to, hold up the cause of Pan-American cooperation, we'll do military exchanges, we'll send military advisors, became a much more concerted effort to maintain a network between and an alliance between the security forces of the Americas. And military aid to Latin American security forces also really dates to this moment. In the immediate years after the war, there were all kinds of debates about whether that should continue, with people in Latin America and in the US on both sides of that debate. But during the Cold War, that form of security cooperation was profoundly important, as I'm sure you and your listeners likely know. So what were the enduring lessons? So one of the things was, as long as the security forces of the Americas were closely knit, and the United States could count on access to defense installations as needed, then maybe the US didn't need the expense or the headache of occupying US bases across Latin America full time. What's more, the US continued to have a military footprint in the Panama Canal Zone, in Puerto Rico, in Guantanamo, in these places that were very different from the wartime defense sites. So there's this ability to maintain some boots on the ground, and also the relationships that would allow US forces the access should they need it. At the same time, the security concerns during the Cold War turned out to be quite different than they had been during World War II. There was a concern about fascism as an ideology in Latin America, but the primary security concern was about the potential for an extra-hemispheric assault on the Americas. During the Cold War, the concern is more squarely ideological, right? This about the spread of communism. And so counterinsurgency becomes much more central to the way that US defense planners thought about security problems in Latin America than extra-hemispheric invasion was. And that had consequences for the kinds of training that the US provided, the kinds of weapons that the US provided, and of course, the way that Latin American civilians experienced the consequences of those security relationships.
That seems like a good place to leave it, I think, before we get into the territory, perhaps, of another book. Professor Herman, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Tyler. I really enjoyed it.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter at patreon.com/lawfare. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for other offerings, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfareblog.com. The podcast is edited by Jen Patia-Howell, and your audio engineer this episode was Kara Schillen of Goat Rodeo. Our music is performed by Sophia Yan. As always, thanks for listening.